There's a lot of things in the NFL that just don't make a ton of sense, whether it be penalties that are called on the field or explanation of rules by former referees in the broadcast booth. It just feels like a lot more times than not, we're left scratching our head and not understanding what exactly is going on. And one thing that I probably understand the least would be the bye weeks. How in the world do they come up with such ridiculous staggered bye weeks? Because once again, here in 2023, we're running into a week where there's going to be a lot of issues. So I would like to be the first to welcome you all to Bye-Mageddon 2023. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? With 6 teams on a bye this week, it is more important than ever with the fantasy playoffs looming large that we make sure we set the best lineup that we can. Now, at the running back position, we are missing a couple of studs, but not very many this week. So we got to have our eyes on the prize, and we got to break down the best lineup that we possibly can. And I'm going to help you do that right now on my start and sit analysis for every matchup at the running back position for week 13. And let's hop right into it and start with Thursday Night Football. When Kenneth Walker went down earlier in their Week 11 matchup, it allowed Zach Charbonnet to come in and get double-digit touches on the ground for the first time all season. And then he followed it up last week with another game of double-digit touches on the ground. But even with the amount of volume he's getting, he hasn't even been able to average 3.5 yards per carry in either of those matchups. So right now, when you take a look at Zach Charbonnet going up against one of the best defenses in the NFL, currently ranked 12th against the run and allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position, Zach Charbonnet is not going to be in a great position to go any higher than what we have already seen. Right now, Charbonnet really is a really risky flex option. That's all we're going to be getting from him. We need a touchdown and hopefully 50 yards. If he can do that, we're happy, but if he doesn't find the end zone, he may not even get to 7 or 8 fantasy points. Well, hey, Tony Pollard, thanks for showing up and being an RB1 each of the last 2 weeks. We've been waiting on this all season, and it's not entirely Tony Pollard's fault. I've talked about it time and time again on this show. It's just the way Dallas is using him. It's so bland. They're running him right up the middle. They're not getting him in space, which is where Tony Pollard excels. But at least the last couple of weeks, he's found the end zone and given you top 12 production in that time. Going up against Seattle, it's absolutely going to be an opportunity for him to have another good day. But here's the kicker. When you take a look at the stats, Seattle's defense is currently ranked 21st against the run, but they allow the 4th most fantasy points to the running back position. How is that? Well, first and foremost, they allow the 2nd most rushing touchdowns on the season so far. And they have allowed the 6th most receiving yards. So even if Tony Pollard isn't going to rack up 80, 90, or 100 yards on the ground, there are 2 other areas that he could really get his fantasy points from: scoring on the ground and helping out through the air. And Tony Pollard does pretty well at both of those things. Let's see if he can make it 3 straight weeks with a rushing touchdown. And if we can find, 50 receiving yards from him this week, he should be easily inside the top 12 and maybe even top 10 once again. Just a couple of weeks ago, the colors would have been a lot different on the screen, and we'll see who's actually listening to the video and who's just looking at the colors, because I'm not putting Austin Ekeler in yellow and Rhamondre Stevenson in green because I'm going to rank Stevenson ahead of Ekeler, because Ekeler still has more upside potential than what Stevenson does, and I think we all just need to be very careful about what New England tries to pull at any point in time. But over the last couple of weeks, Stevenson has been the much better running back. Ekeler hasn't been inside the top 30 in the last 2 weeks. And Rhamondre Stevenson has been inside the top 10 3 of the last 6 games. So when you take a look at the trajectory that these 2 guys are on, it definitely feels like Rhamondre Stevenson is heading in the right direction and Ekeler isn't. But the Los Angeles offense just does not seem to be clicking together right now. And maybe it has to do with all of the injuries. The wide receivers are super banged up. We're looking to see maybe if we get Josh Palmer back this week. And if we do, that could help open up some things. But Austin Ekeler just has not been very efficient, and he's been terrible on the ground. And it doesn't even feel like he's getting the amount of looks in the passing game that he really should be. So is he banged up? Has the offensive scheme changed? What are they trying to do? I just know after back-to-back weeks of bottom 30 performances that Austin Ekeler is going to be a guy that Los Angeles is going to try to get going right away. We're going to see a bounce-back performance here very soon. And he does continue to have more upside than Rhamondre Stevenson. But based on how they are currently playing, Rhamondre Stevenson is going to have a safer floor than what Austin Ekeler does. And for that reason, he's going to be in green this week, because I think we know a little bit more about what we might get from him in the coming matchup, which is going to be better for him than what it be for Austin Ekeler. Detroit at New Orleans is going to be 3 fantasy viable running backs, and not just 3 fantasy viable running backs, but 3 guys that have been in the top 12 consistently over the last few weeks. But there could be a little bit of a risk factor because we are running up against some defenses that do allow very few fantasy points to the running back position. Right now, Detroit is really stopping everything that has to do with running backs. 5th fewest rushing yards and 3rd fewest fantasy points to the running back position. On the flip side, New Orleans does a really good job of limiting damage. They have allowed 1,000 rushing yards on the season, 13th most in the NFL, but they do a really good job of keeping running backs from scoring touchdowns, and they really limit what they can do through the air in the passing game as well. Now, we know David Montgomery is going to be the main back. He's going to be the bruiser, and he's going to be the guy getting a majority of the touches out of the backfield on the ground. He's got a rushing touchdown in every game but one that he's played in so far this season, and that was the game against Tampa Bay that he left early. So I do expect David Montgomery to pick up some yards, and I do expect him to potentially find the end zone once again. He's green because he's still a really safe bet this week. Even if his ceiling doesn't put him very high into the top 12 running backs, he's definitely a guy that I say gives us 70 to 80 yards and a touchdown this week, which is a super nice floor. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to continue to have a higher ceiling for me because of the work that he does do in the passing game and his explosiveness on the ground. But going up against this New Orleans defense that does limit running backs through the air, that's where things get a little bit more risky for me, and that's why he's going to be in yellow this week. Now, more than likely, David Montgomery will be ranked over Jahmyr Gibbs this week because I do believe he has a safer floor. Jahmyr Gibbs will have a higher ceiling. And for Alvin Kamara, he is a guy that really safe floor once again because he's going to be getting those targets from Derek Carr. With the way this Lions defense has played as of recent, I would expect a lot of people to feel like the passing game is going to work really well for New Orleans, especially at the wide receiver position. But Detroit has had a few extra days to rest now after playing on Thursday last week, and hopefully they're back to feeling 100%. But Alvin Kamara is still going to see a lot of dump offs. It would not surprise me if we see him go anywhere from 8 to 10 targets this week and be a big part of the passing game once again, even if his ability to make yards on the ground isn't as good as we would like it to be. He's still going to be a main cog, and that's what's going to make him another safe start this week, and one that will have him inside the top 12, even if his ceiling isn't going to be top 5. The Atlanta Falcons and the New York Jets are going to bring my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week with 2 of the best young running backs in all of football. Listen, we are closing in on the holidays here, and if you're looking for some presents for that significant other or someone special, make sure that you head on over to manscaped.com and check out all of their brand new products that they have got this holiday season. Just use code word headliners at checkout, and you're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. It's really nice to talk about Bijan Robinson when he's coming off of a big game, and I'm not trying to figure out reasons why he sucked because of Arthur Smith the week before, but maybe we're getting some more consistent performances out of Bijan. He's been a top 12 running back each of the last 2 weeks, and he has 3 touchdowns in his last 4 games on the ground. Let's just hope that that volume continues for him and that opportunity continues for him. And going up against the New York Jets, currently allowing the 2nd most rushing yards in the NFL and the 5th most fantasy points to the running back position, will be an excellent week for Bijan Robinson to pop off. And he's going to probably be a top 5 running back for me this week, but he's going to be in yellow. Why? It's because of Arthur Smith. It has nothing to do with Bijan himself. It has nothing to do with his ranking this week. He is in yellow because I just have no idea if Arthur Smith in any given matchup is going to be like, let's give Cordarrelle Patterson more touches than Bijan this week, or let's go ahead and just not get him worked into the passing game. There's just so much that Arthur Smith can do to screw up any given week. Bijan has to be in yellow. Now, he's much closer to green than he is to red, and again, he's going to be a top 5 running back for me this week because that's what his ceiling presents. But I think we just have to be like, all right, Arthur, don't screw this one up. From weeks 5 through 8, Breece Hall finished as a top 8 running back 3 times. And it felt like we were well on our way to finally seeing him fully healthy and utilize the way that people drafted him to be this year. But since then, he's only been a top 24 running back 1 time, and that's when he was the RB17 a couple of weeks ago. Breece Hall right now is unfortunately stuck in this absolute dumpster fire of an offense in New York. They ran with Zach Wilson as long as they could, and now they're running with Tim Boyle. And why in the world they didn't address the quarterback situation right after Aaron Rodgers went down is absolutely beyond me. It's clear you didn't trust Zach Wilson from the start. But now we find ourselves with an offense that just cannot get anything going on a consistent basis. And because of that, teams are absolutely crashing on the run and daring Breece Hall to be the only guy to beat them. And now we find ourselves in a matchup where the Atlanta Falcons allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So with the way that he has been playing as of recent, Breece Hall to me brings a whole lot of risk. He's still going to be in yellow because he's the main guy. He's the starter. He's going to be on the field. He's getting the touches. If there was anybody else on this team getting a decent amount of touches in the backfield as well, Breece Hall would probably be a red right now. Let's just hope that maybe he can crack off a couple of big runs this week, but unfortunately his ceiling is just going to be super low. Arizona and Pittsburgh may not be a ton of fun to watch unless you're a Cardinals or a Steelers fan, but it is going to be a game that is going to bring us some decent fantasy production. James Conner hasn't had that great of a ceiling all year long. He's only got 2 touchdowns, and he's not helping in the passing game, something that when he was with Pittsburgh, he did quite often. So when you take a look at what he could potentially do in this matchup against his former team, it could be a decent day on the ground for him, but that does limit his upside. James Conner is a guy right now that I'm okay tossing in my flex every single week because he's a running back that we know is going to get a decent amount of touches, even if he isn't going over 100 yards and even if he isn't going to score a touchdown. But he's a lot less risky than a lot of other running backs out there and a lot of wide receivers as well. So he's going to be green for me this week because it's an okay matchup against his former team, and I could see him having a good day on the ground and maybe even scoring a touchdown. Now on the other side, Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren have been playing really well lately. In fact, maybe I'm not giving Najee Harris enough credit because since their bye week, he has been a top 12 running back 4 out of 6 games. And I don't think anybody really knew that. So moving forward, in a matchup like this, where Arizona just got throttled on the ground by Kyren Williams, Najee Harris is going to be a good start once again. But so will Jaylen Warren. Now, Jaylen Warren's explosiveness does lend him to a little bit higher of a ceiling than what Najee Harris will typically have, even if Najee Harris might be a little bit safer right now. So we'll see what happens in terms of ceilings and floors this week. But if you own Jaylen Warren and you own Najee Harris, both of them are good starts in this matchup. And maybe Warren has a little bit of a higher ceiling, but Najee to me will also have a higher floor and will probably be the safer of the two given the game that they just had. So about 20 minutes after I finished my running back video, it came out that Jonathan Taylor is dealing with a thumb injury and it could impact him for the rest of the season. So I had to come back to this matchup and redo it for you. This is going to be something that we are going to have to keep a really close eye on. And Per the reports that I've picked up so far, and again, this is very early in the announcement because I came back to redo this right away. It sounds like he played the entire second half with his thumb injury, and he played pretty darn well. So I don't know if it's going to really impact him or if he's going to keep going. Well, we just have to wait and see. The biggest thing that we're going to have to keep an eye on is if he does miss any time, Zach Moss will be a guy that we are going to start working back into our lineup. Obviously, with no Jonathan Taylor, he has shown the ability to be a top 10 running back this season. Now, the biggest question is going to be, okay, so is Jonathan Taylor injured? If so, how does that affect his playing time, even if he does play? Do we see a 50-50 split? Is it still going to be JT? Does JT just handle the carries on the ground and Zach Moss sees the targets through the air? That's where things could get really dicey. And while I'm going to leave both of these guys at a yellow this week, because as of right now, I don't think we have enough information to accurately gauge what we should be doing with these guys. Now, if Jonathan Taylor is playing, if he plays, I'm going to play him. I'm going to start him. If he plays, I'm not going to play Zach Moss this week, though. And if I take an L because of that, that's fine. But I don't want to put him out there and have him be just fine because, once again, he looked fine in the second half. Did lose a few snaps in the second half to Zach Moss, but he still played, scored some touchdowns, had some big runs, and looked good. So we'll really see what happens this week. Keep an eye on it and make sure you come back for the rankings on Thursday so we can get a better idea. The one thing we do know for this week in this matchup, though, is that Derrick Henry will be fantastic because Indianapolis has a really tough time stopping the run. Derrick Henry coming off a good game this past week. And this is absolutely a matchup that Tennessee could keep in a positive game script or a neutral game script for themselves. And if they do that, Derrick Henry will be the guy. Hopefully he sees a few more big plays than what we've seen of recent. If we can get a couple of 10, 20-yard runs from him, that definitely could make out for a huge day. But I wouldn't be surprised if he at least finds the end zone once again. We may not know more about Devon Achane until later in the week, but for right now, we know Raheem Mostert is going to be a guy that we are absolutely putting in our lineups, even if Achane ends up playing. Washington right now is ranked 21st in terms of fantasy points against at the running back position, but over the last 4 weeks, they have allowed the third most fantasy points to the running back position. Their defense, unfortunately, is trending down against running backs, and Raheem Mostert and his big playability plus his nose for the end zone is going to be a great upside play going up against them this week. Now, if Achane ends up playing, it's going to have to be a gut call on your part because this is a matchup that he absolutely could find some big plays in, even if he doesn't get a ton of volume. So it's going to be how comfortable are you with him potentially having to leave the game again or not getting nearly as much touches as he would need to be fantasy viable. When you take a look at it, there's a lot of risk associated with that. And I really can't tell you whether or not you should play him. Like Kyren Williams coming off of his injury, he went out and he absolutely smashed. It didn't happen that way with a Devon Achane. So it can go either way. And depending on what you need this week, maybe that type of risk just isn't going to need to be associated with your roster. Brian Robinson is like the definition of what this video is about. Trying to figure out risk versus reward. Who's safer? Who has more upside? Who has more floor? And who's the guy that we just don't know what they're going to do on a weekly basis? That's Brian Robinson, because to begin the year, he had some good games. And then he was barely giving you borderline RB2 numbers. And then all of a sudden, a couple of weeks ago, he comes out as the RB1, the RB11, and then he drops all the way to RB33 this past week. He hasn't had a consistent amount of touches on the ground. 1 week he might get passing work and the next week he might not get anything. It's really kind of all over the place with him right now. And unfortunately, in a tougher matchup going up against Miami where he could A, be game scripted out, or B, have a really low ceiling because he's going up against a run defense that is very good, he's the type of guy that you put in your lineup and you never really know what you're going to get from him. So when you start Brian Robinson this week, because let's face it, if you have Brian Robinson, you're probably not in a position to even bench him anyway. You don't know if it's going to be a really high ceiling or really low floor, if he's going to be an RB2 or an RB1, or if he's going to completely tank your week. For this matchup, maybe we shouldn't focus on the pass, because if you take a look at the overall season numbers, Houston and Denver have not done that great against running backs. maybe we should look at a little bit of a smaller sample size that's a little bit more recent, because over the last 4 weeks, these defenses have been a whole lot better against running backs. Houston right now over the last 4 weeks have allowed the 10th fewest rushing yards. And while Denver is still giving up a few too many yards on the ground, over the last 4 weeks, they are only ranked 18th against the run instead of 32nd like they have been all season long. So there is a lot of risk associated with all the running backs in this matchup. Javonte Williams is getting almost all of the touches, it feels like, for the Denver backfield. The volume is there for him, and he's getting more touches than a lot of running backs are right now. But Houston's defense right now is playing great, and I definitely could see him struggling to get going all day long. On the Houston side, the biggest issue is that they throw the ball so much. CJ Stroud is having a fantastic season, and I could see them attacking this secondary through the air as much as possible, and adding that along with the fact that Dameon Pierce has returned and is also getting snaps and touches right now. Devin Singletary isn't the safest start in the world that he was a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of risk with every running back associated with this matchup. If I had to pick one person to have the highest ceiling, it would probably be Devin Singletary. 7 targets last week, but that's the first time this season that he's exceeded 2 targets in a game. So I don't know if that's something that we can just bet on. If he can find himself a couple of big plays or even have a couple of really nice drives, he probably has more fantasy points than any of the running backs in this matchup. But if Denver comes to play and plays against Houston the way they have as of recent, there definitely is going to be some issues with them getting going on the ground as well. Tampa Bay's defense, which currently allows the 10th fewest rushing yards and 5th fewest fantasy points to the running back position, did get blown up a little bit last week by a really good performance from Jonathan Taylor and the Colts. But Jonathan Taylor and the Colts are not Carolina, Miles Sanders, and Chuba Hubbard. So I really don't think that's going to happen again this week. And once again, even with Chuba Hubbard making a decent amount of plays in the passing game last week and scoring a touchdown, I'm not interested in even trying to risk it in such a tough matchup this week. However, Rachaad White will get another really good matchup for himself. And he ran for 100 yards this past week, by far his best game on the ground this season in terms of volume and efficiency. And hopefully we see it again right here, because if it happens, he's going to be inside probably the top 10, but he's got to score, because even with 100 rushing yards last week and not a whole lot of volume in the passing game, he didn't even break the top 15 running backs. So we need the 100 yards on the ground, but we also need a little bit of work in the passing game or a touchdown, the two things that have propped him up to the level that have made him consistent the last few weeks. Don't let the colors fool you. Just because Jerome Ford and Kyren Williams are both in yellow doesn't mean they're going to be anywhere close in the rankings this week, because that's just not happening. Jerome Ford is exactly the guy that I tried to tell you all that he was. He's inconsistent at best, and his numbers over the last few weeks absolutely reinforce that. Over the last 4 weeks, in matchups against Arizona and Pittsburgh, which were favorable to him on the ground, he wasn't even able to average 2.5 yards per carry. But 3 weeks ago when they played Baltimore, the dude had a huge game over 100 yards. And this past week, another really good matchup supposedly against Denver, he did okay. Average yards per carry was good, was a little bit more efficient, but didn't really get a whole lot done and didn't find the end zone. It's going to be the same thing with Jerome Ford. Really, in all honesty, he's a low-end RB2. Kareem Hunt is not getting the touches that he was at one point, those goal line touches, because they haven't really found themselves in the situation to give him those anyway. There's been a lot of neutral and negative game script for Cleveland here recently, and because of that, he hasn't really been utilized the same way he was when he was a top 20 running back. So Jerome Ford is the only one worth starting in Cleveland right now. But if you're starting him and you're still hoping for RB1-like numbers, you're going to continue to be disappointed, unfortunately. Kyren Williams is absolutely that dude. I mean, I am blown away by the performance that we have seen from him so far this season. He unfortunately missed 4 games with an ankle injury, but he has 5 games inside the top 7 running backs, 4 of those games inside the top 5 and the #1 overall running back last week on his way back from injury. This week against Cleveland, it's a tough matchup. And for him to put up well over 100 yards on the ground probably isn't going to happen this week. But we saw what he can do in the passing game, which is where I think he still gets involved this week, especially given the fact that Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua do not look to be 100%. So is he a top 5 running back this week? Probably not. Is he a top 12 running back this week? He's going to be just inside that area. Not the highest ceiling in the world, but given the fact that he's being utilized more than 95% of the running backs in the NFL right now, I'd be willing to risk it with that all day long. For San Francisco and Philadelphia, is this going to turn into a battle of the defenses where we should really look at the under on everything? Or are we going to find a little bit of offense in this matchup, but maybe only from specific players? Because on the ground, specifically for running backs, this may be one of the toughest matchups we see not only this week, but this season. Right now, San Francisco allows the 2nd fewest rushing yards and the 6th fewest fantasy points to running backs. And Philadelphia allows the 3rd fewest rushing yards and the lowest amount of fantasy points to the running back position. We could see the running backs absolutely stuffed up this week. Now, Christian McCaffrey is going to be green because even in his toughest matchups, you can still bet that he's going to have a nose for the end zone. Touchdowns in all but 1 game so far this season. So absolutely, if we can find a way to drive the ball down the field against that poor Philadelphia secondary, San Francisco could set Christian McCaffrey up for a touchdown a couple of different times this week. And of course, his contributions in the passing game will also be felt as well. Now, for my underdog pick'em of the week, I am willing to go lower on Christian McCaffrey's current line of 71.5 rushing yards, because this is going to be a really tough matchup where I fully believe that San Francisco is going to be throwing the ball more times than not. Christian McCaffrey still may get around 15 carries, but going up above 71 rushing yards this week, I really feel could be a tall task against this Philadelphia front. But this past week, we had another super successful week over on Underdog shooting through those pick'ems. So if you're interested in playing this one or any of the other ones that we talk about here or in Discord, make sure that you head on over to Underdog and sign up now and make your first time deposit using code word headline. Underdog is going to match your first time deposit up to $100, and they're also going to give you a special pick'em to play this week that's almost guaranteed to hit. You'll definitely want to throw that one in with a few others that we talk about. Now for DeAndre Swift, it really has been underwhelming performances, it feels like, as of late. On the ground the last couple of weeks is just a pure NFL running back. It hasn't been that bad, but unfortunately it's not really translating to fantasy points. Since week 2, DeAndre Swift has only been a top 10 running back 1 time. And even though he has finished inside the top 12 a few times at number 11, we have seen him digress more to being like a mid to low end RB2 than a guy that is showing us the type of upside that we saw at the beginning of the year. Since week 6, he's only ran for over 70 yards twice, and that is really concerning considering the fact that he's not getting nearly enough work in the passing game right now. And that's why he finally has such a low ceiling. Even with the explosive plays that we saw at the beginning of the year, they have not come back as of recent. So really, when you take a look at DeAndre Swift, I think if you're banking on mid RB2 with a little low RB1 upside, you're okay to go that route. But this matchup against this defense, I really don't know if that upside will be there at all. Thanks to a couple of touchdowns, Isaiah Pacheco saw his second top 10 finish of the season. And my hope is this week going up against Green Bay, he could end up seeing the same thing. Now, this past week against Detroit, Green Bay played in positive game script the entire way. And unfortunately, because of that, and Detroit kept giving them the ball back, Detroit really couldn't establish their run the way that they like to. David Montgomery still had a pretty good day. Jahmyr Gibbs didn't really get the game script that he would have needed, but Isaiah Pacheco could end up benefiting from the same thing this week if it flips on the other end and Kansas City can play in a positive game script or even keep it neutral, because that's where Isaiah Pacheco succeeds. When Kansas City keeps things neutral or positive, he is a guy that's almost guaranteed to give you RB2 numbers. Now, the RB1 upside that we thought he may have had at the beginning of the season has hasn't been there. But he's such a good running back in terms of fighting for yards and breaking off some big plays and breaking tackles that even if he doesn't get as much volume as we would like, he definitely can push things forward. Now, his key contributions in the passing game really seem to benefit him more when Jerick McKinnon is missing. We'll see if Jerick McKinnon misses again this week, but for me, in this matchup against Green Bay, whose run defense has been suspect this season, he could still have a really nice floor. Kansas City's run defense has taken a little bit of a step back here of recent. We don't know if Aaron Jones is going to be good to go this week. It would be quite possible that we see him miss another game or two because they are going to want to keep him healthy, especially if they plan on making a playoff run, which by the looks of the rest of the season schedule, it absolutely could happen, which is going to leave A.J. Dillon as the main guy. But once again, if Green Bay's in positive game script, that's okay. But it doesn't make A.J. Dillon any more than kind of a low-end RB2. 24 was his ranking the last 2 weeks, and those were in games that he probably should have done a lot better. Now, Detroit's defense last week, still really good against the run, so I see why he had a little bit of a lower ceiling, even when they were able to run the ball a little bit more. But going up against Kansas City, if they're negative in any way, it's definitely going to give him issues reaching his upside. Prior to this past week, Joe Mixon had been a top 24 running back in 5 of his last 6 games. Truly the definition of a floor this ceiling. Hasn't provided a ton of upside, but given the fact that you were getting a pretty decent discount on draft day, except for those of you that overdrafted him, you really haven't had much to be upset about with his performances. You could put him in as an RB2 or a flex, and for a majority of the games this season, you're getting decent numbers that aren't losing you a week, even if they are winning you a week. Now this week, he gets Jacksonville, ranked number 4 against the run right now, and it's going to be another tough matchup. And unfortunately, with Jake Browning at the helm last week, even though I thought Joe Mixon could be a guy that absolutely would be a much safer bet, he didn't end up coming through for us because Cincinnati just wasn't able to get the run going. Do they do it this week against Jacksonville? I think they try a little bit harder, but unfortunately the ceiling for Mixon I don't think is there unless they get him more involved in the passing game. Now, Cincinnati allows the 4th most rushing yards in the NFL right now, and this is the perfect matchup for Travis Etienne to get back on track. And I know a lot of you have been pretty down about his last couple of performances, and I get why. We haven't seen the ceiling, but this week is absolutely going to be a great opportunity to do just that. Cincinnati's defense has struggled against the run all season long. Why don't you take a little bit of pressure off Trevor Lawrence and don't make him go win you a game like you have been so much this season? Let Travis Etienne run the football, and I think we see a much better week. In fact, Travis Etienne will be firmly inside my top 10 with top 5 upside. Yo, Headliner Nation, there you have it, my start and sit analysis for every matchup at the running back position here in week 13. Don't forget, later in the week on Thursday, tune in for those running back rankings to get all of your updated information. And I've got that Manscaped giveaway from last week that I still need to announce. Hit that like button for me on the way out, subscribe if you're new here, and of course, turn on the bell notifications so anytime we go live or drop new content, you're gonna know about it right away. Headliner Nation, all of you need to stay safe and healthy out there, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.